Back, and today I'm going to go over AMDY. If you guys remember previously in the last piece of content that we had released or I had put out, we had spoken about TSLY, and today we're going to speak about AMDY, which is actually a converse fund, which is similar to the way that TSLY operates. The only difference is that it covers AMD, but without any further ado, let's get into yet another YieldMax fund. So again, I'm not going to take too long on this. What is AMDY? It is, again, another options fund that essentially yields returns by selling and buying options, selling puts, buying calls, buying puts, this kind of nature, just essentially options. And it earns the income, and then it does that on the AMD stock. Again, another important note, I'm not too sure if AMD has a dividend, but I believe they don't. But if there's any special distribution that they do give, any YieldMax shareholders that own AMDY are not going to be considered for receiving the distribution. So now let's look at the fund holdings. Now, similar to TSLY, the AMDY holdings are pretty much the same. The only difference would be that the purchased call options and the sold put options and the shorts are all just on the AMD stock instead of on the Tesla stock, which is what makes it different. One key thing to note about this fund, which is kind of nicer than TSLY, is that in the time since inception, it actually hasn't taken a loss. And on top of that, you've collected about 12% in distributions in just about 2 months, which is something that is pretty nice, considering that TSLY hasn't done the same. However, in the same regard, we look at TSLA or Tesla and TSLY, and the share price of Tesla has actually gone down significantly. So that would make sense on why TSLY has gone down a certain amount. And as we can see here, there's also the US Treasury securities and cash, which pretty much all of these YieldMax funds hold. Another key thing to note is that about, I think, 18 million is what the net assets of this fund are. So if there's any large swing activity, it's going to be because it's a very small value of the fund, and there's very small amount invested because it was just incepted about 2 or 3 months ago. So that's just something to keep in mind. But a lot of these funds and YieldMax, they all keep a lot of treasury securities and cash, which is a substantial portion of their portfolio, which I guess they do in order to keep kind of a bolster and keep the investors happy. Now, if we look at the yield as we did for TSLY, we see that the last distribution was actually about 1.1181, which is $1 per share, $1.11, and it was declared on the 7th. It was the ex-dividend date, which means you had to own it before that certain date in order to get the distribution or qualify for it, and the record date was the 9th, with it being paid on the 16th. Key thing to note about this as well is it's a significantly higher distribution than TSLY. Now, while people have said that TSLY is 70%, if you look at some of these other people that are covering this, it's actually around 57.9 is around that, which is what we calculated in the last content that I had put out. And now when we look at this, it's actually genuinely higher by about 7% based on this distribution. While we can't come to the exact conclusion of what it's going to be in the future, this is the first distribution, and this is the piece of data that we have to work with to determine what the distribution return is going to be on the next declared dividend. However, all of this aside, 66.3 is significantly high, especially when looking at the actual share price valuation, which is actually what I'm going to cover next. And if we can see that here, the share price value is about $20 and some odd change, 24 cents, and it's up 1.2% from inception, which is not including the dividend returns. And that's obviously something nice to note when we look at TSLY, where it's down 30 to 40% from, over the last year, whereas this is obviously on the upside and has a higher return. Now, when we look at this, you may be asking, what are my thoughts? And I'm going to give that to you right now. So my thoughts is that this is a buy opportunity. Now, you might ask, why is it a buy opportunity? Well, I mean, it's pretty simple. If we look at, AMD as a whole, it's down about 24% from all-time high. And since AMDY was only incepted 2 months ago and it's showing such promising, returns at about 1.2% in share price and 12% in distributions, we see that if AMD has upside, we might be able to capture some of that too, depending on how they do their options calls, if they buy calls or if they buy puts, depending on market conditions. However, there's about a 24% upside on AMD stock, which might transition into the AMDY stock as well. Now, Case scenario 2, swing trade volatility. So obviously this stock, similar to TSLY, moves about 1 to 3% a day, upwards or downwards, which allows for potential profits when we see a reversal upward. Generally, this is when the stock has fallen a significant amount. Case in point, AMD, and we see AMDY mirror that into some certain regard, and we can essentially capture a certain share price that is below what it's been trading at normally, and we can see that upward as it changes and goes upwards in price. Now, side by side, let's compare. So when we look at AMD, it's about 16.28% up in the past 6 months. And we look at from inception, which is a more keynote way to compare these two. Essentially 9.5% is what AMD is up in this period of time. And we have basically AMDY, which is up 1.2%. Now, looking at these two together, I apologize, that is wrong, but essentially AMD is up about 9.55% return since September, whereas AMDY is up 12.25% when you include the dividend return and 1.2% on share price. So it actually outperformed had you generally just bought the AMD stock. However, we haven't included the taxes that you're going to pay on these dividends. However, if you're around 20 to 30%, you can kind of come to that math yourself. So obviously, my thoughts are that this is a buy when compared to TSLY, but that's generally because Tesla's just on a downtrend right now. But that is my thoughts on AMDY. If you guys enjoyed this piece of content, be sure to subscribe for more and like the video and comment if you have any other questions. Thank you very much.